The forest was silent, but the silence was wrong. 6 years after 3 legions vanished into the German wilderness, a Roman general named Germanicus led his soldiers back into that same tangle of oak and marsh, and what they found there stopped even hardened veterans in their tracks. Bleached bones lay scattered across the forest floor in heaps, some still fused to fragments of rusted armor. Skulls had been nailed to tree trunks, deliberately placed at eye level, as if the forest itself were keeping watch over the men who had died there. Nearby stood crude altars, stained dark, where Roman officers had been ritually sacrificed by their captors. The historian Tacitus recorded that the soldiers of Germanicus, weeping openly, gathered the remains of their countrymen and buried them in a single mound, unable to tell which bones belonged to which man, friend indistinguishable from stranger, all of them equally consumed by the same catastrophe. This was the Teutoburg Forest, and in the autumn of 9 AD, it had swallowed an entire Roman army whole. Before that name became synonymous with disaster, this stretch of forest in what is now northwestern Germany was simply part of the vast, dense wilderness the Romans called Germania, a land they viewed as both an opportunity and a threat. The forest itself sprawled across low ridges and narrow valleys near the Wehen Hills, choked with old-growth oak, alder, and beech, its floor perpetually damp from the region's marshes and unpredictable rains. Roman writers describe Germania as an almost impenetrable wilderness, cold, wet, and thick with fog that could swallow visibility within paces. For an army accustomed to open roads and organized terrain, this landscape was disorienting in a way that few other frontiers were. If you're drawn to the places where history and mystery intertwine, stay with this story, because what happened in these trees would haunt the Roman Empire for generations. By the early 1st century, Rome had spent decades pushing its frontier eastward across the Rhine, attempting to fold Germania into the empire the way it had folded Gaul. Augustus appointed Publius Quinctilius Varus as governor of the region, a capable administrator, but a man with limited experience in frontier warfare, more accustomed to the ordered provinces of Syria than the unpredictable tribal politics of the Germanic peoples. Rome believed the region was largely pacified. Roman roads, markets, and administrative structures had begun to appear among the Germanic tribes, and Varus governed as though the conquest were essentially complete. This assumption would prove fatal. Among the Germanic elite serving Rome was a young nobleman of the Cherusci tribe named Arminius. He had been raised partly within the Roman system, trained in Roman military tactics, and had even received Roman citizenship and equestrian rank. To Varus, Arminius appeared to be a loyal ally, a bridge between Roman authority and Germanic cooperation. In reality, Arminius had spent years quietly building a coalition among rival tribes, uniting groups that had historically fought each other against their common occupier. This is where documented history becomes genuinely suspenseful, because the betrayal that followed was not the work of an external enemy Rome could have anticipated, but of a man Rome had trained, trusted, and embraced. In the late summer of 9 AD, Arminius informed Varus of a supposed uprising in a distant part of the province, urging the governor to march his forces to suppress it. Trusting his informant completely, Varus set out with 3 legions, the 17th, 18th, and 19th, along with auxiliary troops, and a substantial baggage train that included women, children, and merchants traveling with the army, a common practice for what Varus believed would be a routine march through friendly territory. Historical estimates place the total number of people in this column at somewhere between 15 and 20,000. Arminius rode with them, then slipped away under the pretext of gathering additional allied troops. He never returned to Roman ranks. Instead, he began coordinating the ambush that had been planned for months. The Roman column was drawn into the narrow, forested terrain near what archaeologists now identify as the Calcrease Ridge, a landscape that offered the legions almost no room to maneuver. On one side rose a steep, forested hill. On the other lay treacherous bog. Rain had turned the ground into thick mud, slowing the heavily laden baggage train and stretching the marching column into a long, vulnerable line, kilometers in length. This is precisely the terrain where Germanic warriors, who had spent their lives navigating this landscape, held every advantage over Roman soldiers trained for the discipline of open-field battle. The ambush began with javelins hurled from the tree line, and it did not stop for 3 days. According to the account preserved by the historian Cassius Dio, the fighting occurred in relentless, punishing rain, which soaked the Roman soldiers' shields and rendered their bowstrings useless, while the attacking tribes, familiar with the wet climate, adapted far more easily. The legions attempted to build fortified camps each night, archaeological traces of which have since been discovered at Calcarees, but each morning brought renewed attacks as they tried to press forward through hostile terrain that funneled them into narrow corridors between forest and marsh. Soldiers who broke formation to escape the chaos were cut down or captured. Officers, including Varus himself, understood by the second day that the situation was catastrophic and likely unsurvivable. What happened to Varus is documented with unusual clarity for an event of this era. Rather than face capture, Varus took his own life by falling on his sword, a decision consistent with Roman traditions surrounding honor in defeat. Several of his senior officers reportedly did the same. The remaining soldiers, leaderless and surrounded, continued to be slaughtered or captured over the following day. By the time the violence ended, an estimated 15,000 to 20,000 Romans were dead, an almost complete annihilation of 3 entire legions, a loss so severe that those legion numbers, 17, 18, and 19, were never used again in the entire history of the Roman army. If a moment in ancient history deserves to be called a turning point, this is it, and understanding why requires stepping back to see how Rome, and the wider world, reacted. News of the disaster reached Rome and, according to the biographer Suetonius, devastated Augustus so profoundly that witnesses described him repeatedly striking his head against a door, crying out for Varus to give him back his legions. This was not simply grief over lost soldiers. It represented a fundamental shift in Roman ambition. Augustus had envisioned Germania as a permanent Roman province, its frontier eventually stretching to the Elbe River. After Teutoburg, that vision was effectively abandoned. Rome would launch punitive campaigns into Germanic territory in the years that followed, including the expedition led by Germanicus that recovered the remains scattered across the battlefield. But the empire never again attempted the full-scale annexation of the region east of the Rhine. In this sense, the forest did not merely swallow an army, it swallowed an imperial ambition that had shaped decades of Roman policy. The physical remains of that catastrophe vanished from historical memory almost as thoroughly as the men who died there. For nearly 2,000 years, the precise location of the battle remained unknown, debated by historians, argued over by scholars relying only on the fragmentary accounts left by Tacitus and Cassius Dio. Local folklore across the region grew around the forest during the intervening centuries, communities passing down stories of restless spirits and cursed ground, tales shaped less by verified memory of the Roman defeat and more by the simple human instinct to explain unsettling places through legend rather than documentation. It is worth pausing here to distinguish between what history actually records and what later generations imagined. The archaeological reality of the battle is dramatic enough without embellishment. The ghost stories that accumulated over centuries reflect how communities processed inherited unease about a landscape whose true history had been lost, not additional evidence of anything supernatural. The breakthrough that finally identified the battlefield came through patient, methodical work rather than sudden revelation. In 1987, a British Army officer and amateur archaeologist named Tony Clun began surveying the Calcrease area using a metal detector, uncovering Roman coins and small lead sling bullets of a type used by Roman auxiliary troops. These initial finds prompted more rigorous archaeological investigation, and over the following years, researchers uncovered an extraordinary concentration of Roman military equipment scattered across the ridge, including helmet fragments, armor plating, weapon parts, and the remains of what appears to be a defensive rampart, matching descriptions of the terrain preserved by Roman historians. Excavators also found scattered human and animal bones, consistent with a mass casualty event, followed by an extended period of exposure before eventual burial, aligning closely with Tacitus's account of Germanicus's soldiers finding unburied remains years after the battle. For anyone fascinated by how physical evidence can finally confirm centuries of textual history, this discovery stands as one of the great archaeological validations of an ancient literary account, and it deserves far more recognition than it often receives. So, if this story is holding your attention, consider staying through to the end, because there is more to uncover about how this single battle reshaped an entire frontier. The findings at Calcrease did more than confirm a location. They allowed historians to reconstruct the battle with a level of detail rarely possible for ancient warfare. The layout of the discovered rampart suggests the Germanic warriors had prepared the ambush site in advance, constructing earthworks specifically designed to funnel Roman forces into the narrowest, most disadvantageous stretch of terrain between the hillside and the bog. This detail transforms the popular image of a chaotic tribal uprising into something far more calculated, a coordinated military operation planned by Arminius with intimate knowledge of both Roman tactics and Germanic terrain, executed with a level of strategic sophistication that Roman commanders had not anticipated from a people they viewed as disorganized. The coins recovered from the site, many dating no later than 9 AD, provided crucial dating evidence that helped researchers confirm this was indeed the site of Varus's defeat, rather than a later, unrelated skirmish. Even with this archaeological confirmation, aspects of the battle remain genuinely unresolved within the historical record, and it is important to be honest about the limits of what can be known. The exact number of Roman dead is an estimate rather than a precise figure, drawn from calculations of typical legion size rather than a surviving casualty count. The full extent of the battlefield, which likely spanned a considerably larger area than has been excavated, means that portions of the story may remain literally buried and undiscovered. And while Tacitus's account of skulls nailed to trees and officers sacrificed at makeshift altars aligns with broader Roman descriptions of Germanic ritual practices recorded elsewhere, it reaches us through Roman sources writing about their enemies, a perspective worth acknowledging even as the underlying archaeological evidence for violence at the site remains unambiguous. What became of Arminius himself is documented, though considerably less dramatically than his role in the ambush might suggest. He continued to lead Germanic resistance against subsequent Roman campaigns for several years, defeating further Roman incursions, but his unification of the tribes proved as fragile as Rome's own hold on the region had been. Internal rivalries among the Germanic leaders who had briefly united against Rome eventually turned against Arminius himself, and according to the Roman historian Tacitus, he was killed by members of his own faction around 21 AD, betrayed in turn, much as he had once betrayed Varus. It is a detail historians often note for its grim symmetry, though nothing in the record suggests Arminius saw it coming any more than Varus had. Centuries after the battle faded into uncertain memory, Arminius was reimagined by later generations under the Germanized name Hermann, celebrated as a unifying national figure in a wave of 19th century monument building that culminated in a massive statue erected near Detmold, a considerable distance from the actual Calcrease battlefield that archaeology would later confirm. This later reverence tells us a great deal about how distant historical events can be reshaped to serve the needs of the generations that rediscover them, but it is worth separating clearly from the documented 9th century event itself. The forest's genuine historical significance does not require this later embellishment. The confirmed archaeological and textual record is striking enough on its own terms. What the Teutoburg forest ultimately represents is not a supernatural mystery, but a thoroughly human one, a landscape that became fearsome because of what real people did to each other within it, and because that violence was significant enough to alter the trajectory of an empire. The dense trees and marshy ground did not conjure the disaster. They simply provided the conditions under which a devastatingly effective ambush became possible, conditions that Arminius understood and exploited with ruthless precision, while Varus, trusting and unprepared, marched his legions into a trap from which almost none of them would emerge. For nearly 2 millennia afterward, this stretch of German wilderness carried the weight of that catastrophe, remembered first through grieving Roman soldiers who could not distinguish one comrade's bones from another's, then through generations of scattered oral tradition, and finally through the patient work of archaeologists who confirmed with physical evidence what ancient historians had recorded in ink. If there is a lasting lesson in the story of this forest, it may be this: that the ground beneath dense trees can hold history in astonishing detail, waiting in silence for centuries until someone is willing to look closely enough to let it speak again. That is the true legacy of the forest that swallowed an army, a story worth remembering, and if it moved you, worth sharing with others who have never heard how 3 Roman legions marched into the trees and simply never came out.